Hi, I'm Phil from My Safeguarding, and I'm joined by Laura, and we're here to talk to you today about practices, which sits as part of the operations section of the Safeguarding framework. So Laura, when we talk about practices, what do we mean by that?
Yeah, good question, Phil. So I think the easiest way to describe it is to talk about policies, procedure and practice as well, collectively. So policy being the overarching commitment of an organisation, of what they're going to do. And the procedure is really how to, the step-by-step process of how to do something. And then practices is really what actually happens on the ground. So that can be formal documentation. In our early learning centres, for example, there may be practice guidelines on how to change a nappy, for example. But it also can just be the result of what happens over time and the result of culture in an organisation.
So you talked about documentation. So what do you mean? When can practice be? Have you got an example of when practice could be documentation?
So the National Safeguarding Guidance is a great example and a great one-stop shop of all things practice. And that's a really good point, I guess, to first head to and see if you can get your answer there. And obviously more localised information will be relevant for each sector as well, but definitely the Safeguarding Guidance, and it really gives practical tips, templates, tools, resources, all those things to support you in your role.
Awesome. And then the other thing you talked about was actually practice is actually on the ground. So have you got an example of like a practice on the ground?
Yeah, a great one, which Phil actually told me was, but it's really relevant and it's really valid and true, is, you know, if the, I guess, policy or procedural standpoint is that you always have ID on you. So say, for example, in a sporting setting, is that everybody should be identifiable with who they work for and who they're with. So always having like a lanyard or a pass on you to identify yourself. Is then seeing someone who's not wearing their lanyard, what do you do? So that would be an example of poor practice, okay? And look, it can be hard to call somebody out for that, especially if they're more senior than you are, or say a CEO or a manager, that kind of level. But that is the kind of challenge that we have to be able to do, and to call out that poor practice. So it may not necessarily be against the law or anything like that, but we know as part of the culture here at the Y, that's not what we do, and being able to call that out is a really great example.
That's a really good example, because that low level poor practice is actually where we change the culture, isn't it? So if by actually making sure we call out the small things, we probably might get to those big things.
Exactly. And it should be noted that it is different to mandatory reporting and it is different to reportable conduct. Some of this stuff is low level, but it absolutely is still important and it needs to be challenged when appropriate.
Brilliant. Thanks, Laura.
No worries.